Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. As Wayne has said, normally we would have had this presentation last week, particularly on, or very close to Yuri's night. But what I decided to do this year was, remembering that this is in fact the 60th anniversary of the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, which was in the January of 1963. It's also the 20th anniversary, excuse me, I'm sorry, the 40th anniversary of the first American woman in space. So we thought that for this year, we'd actually devote the Yuri's Night talk to the women of the final frontier and give a very quick overview of the role of women in space. And let's see if my computer is, of course, going to freeze up. So let's try. We try this instead. There we go. Okay, now science fiction, right from the very early days, has wanted to tell us that women more or less had two roles in space. Either they were sex symbols of one sort or another. This is right back in the Nymphets of 1902, the very first science fiction film, Georges Méliès's Voyage de la Lune, or Trip to the Moon. But, you know, even up in the 70s with in fact, the early 80s, Princess Leia, despite the fact that she's normally put forward as, you know, a very powerful and capable politician, she also had femme fatale treatment. Another role, of course, for women in space was to be wives and mothers, or even if they were quite competent ladies, like Maureen Robinson, Dr. Robinson. She was a doctor, she was a biologist, but most of the time we saw her doing the washing or providing the food for the family. Very rarely did she get to act in her professional capacity. Similarly, even in 2000, the movie Red Planet, here we have Mission Commander Kate Bowman. She's leading the first mission to Mars, or the first successful mission to Mars, but she's really only there to be a love interest to Val Kilmer's character, who's the hero of the story. So those are the roles that were mostly women were cast in, although there were some exceptions, and a few of them that are often a little bit surprising to people these days. In the film Frau im Mond, the great German science fiction classic of 1929, we have Frida, who essentially was an assistant, more or less a glorified secretary to the one of the inventors of the rocket that goes to the moon, but she turns out to be more courageous than some of the crew and actually elects to stay on the moon with her her boyfriend, who after there's an accident that they don't have enough oxygen for the whole crew to get back to Earth, the boyfriend elects to stay on the moon, and she offers to stay with him. So she showed herself to be more courageous than many of the other people in the crew. Similarly, in the Russian classic Kosmicheski Reis from the 1930s, Marina, we see her here, the assistant to the professor who invents the rocket, proves to be more courageous and more capable than the professional astronaut who is her boyfriend, who's too afraid to go on the mission. And so she joins the professor. In the 1950s, we had Dr. Van Horn in Rocket Ship XM, who's actually she's a chemist, but she's also the propulsion scientist and the fuel scientist. And she actually has a very active role in almost saving that particular mission. Some of you might remember Venus in Fireball XL5, one of my favorite Jerry Anderson productions. She's a doctor of space medicine. She's a doctor of space psychology. She can pilot the spacecraft, and she's also the leader of an expedition to settle on a new planet. So a very capable woman, but even then they get her to do the serve the coffee and make the meals. Of course, many of you will know Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek, who begins pretty much as a glorified space telephonist, answering and making the radio calls. But across the course of the original series, and then in the movies and the extensions from that, we see her being portrayed more and more as a successful professional woman and ultimately the captain of a spacecraft herself within the United Federation of Planets in Starfleet. And the character of Uhura is actually very important because not only do we see in her a very positive role model generally for women who are interested in space, but particularly at the time for Black women. And in fact, she spearheaded for NASA at one point a campaign, particularly to get, excuse me, to get the Black community and also other people of color into science and technology careers, getting young women interested in science and technology careers using the power of the recognition of Uhura as this successful space professional. Now, there weren't many women involved in the actual earliest developments of rocketry. There are a couple of examples around. I mean, this is not to say, of course, there were many wives and girlfriends who stood behind all the young men who were doing their rocketry experiments and helping keep their lives and their families going in various ways. But there weren't many who were actively involved, but you might actually notice, by the way, just before we go to this lady, this is the GERD-10. This was the first Soviet liquid fuel rocket launched in 1933. This man here you might recognize from some of my previous talks. That is, of course, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program. But one of his colleagues was this lady. Now, I don't even know what her first name is. I've only seen it written as L.N. Kolbazina. So if anybody knows what her first name is, I would love to know. But she was one of the 3 designers of the GERD-10 rocket. So she was playing quite an important engineering and development role in this rocket. In England, we had in Scotland, as a matter of fact, the Paisley Rocketeers, one of the many small amateur rocket societies. And this lady is Elizabeth Stewart. She's actually the sister of one of the young men who set up the society, and she became involved in helping to test the little rockets. And this one here, you can see it's actually got a little camera in it. She's getting ready to mount this one on the launch stand here. But not very many women involved in this pre-war period. After the war, though, we actually begin to see a change with women becoming involved in the behind-the-scenes aspects of developing rocketry, particularly in the missile programs after the Second World War. I'm sure you've all seen the movie Hidden Figures or read the book. Shame on you if you haven't at least seen the film. It's an excellent film, and the book is even better, well worth reading. And of course, they tell the story of the Black women at Langley, excuse me, Langley Research Centre, who were involved initially in missile and aviation work, and then, of course, in the early space program. And what they were doing, of course, was the heavy number crunching. I'm sure some of you have attended or read Toner's book about the women who were involved in the human computers working on some of the early astronomical work in the United States, and then also in observatories here in Australia. The role of the computer was originally in the 19th century and earlier one that was undertaken usually by young men at the start of their careers in astronomy or engineering, any of these areas that needed some very heavy number crunching, when, of course, electronic computers as we know them didn't exist. By the Second World War, these roles had been largely passed over to women because it was cheaper to employ the women, essentially. And so we see them, especially then after the war, becoming very widely used in the aviation and the aerospace industry as it grew. So in the US, you had the groups that worked for the NACA. That was the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which became ultimately NASA. At Langley, they had both a team of white women, being in the segregated South. They had a team of white women and a team of Black women who were working on these number crunching programs as calculators. Probably the most famous is Katherine Johnson, who became quite a senior mathematician and engineer with NASA. She actually passed away only in 2020 at the age of 101, and she had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in, I think it was 2015, I think it was. But yeah, 2015. These ladies here, these are actually the original computers from JPL. So they were doing a lot of the early work on the missile work that JPL was involved with back in its early days. And we also had computing ladies here in Australia supporting the work at Woomera. In the very early days, all the test data had to be recorded on film because magnetic tape wasn't easily available. So then you can see this is one of the film sort of images you'd have with the data filmed literally on the bottom there. But they'd also have to measure off angles from the film footage itself so that they could actually see how the rocket rolled, for example. And this is one of the computers doing this work in the early 50s. After they'd read off all the data from the films, they'd then be doing the number crunching. When they introduced the first computers at Woomera, they would assist in inputting the data into the computers, and they would also then double check it all when it came out. Among their other roles was in fact also operating the cameras that did a lot of this optical tracking of the early missile and rocket programs. An interesting contribution that was made by the computers, particularly a lady by the name of Mary Whitehead, not to be confused with Mary Whitehouse, the English Wowser campaigner. But Mary Whitehead actually was the person who came up with this idea of this diagonal stripe that you see around the first stage of the Europa rocket. So this is the blue street stage of the Eldo program's Europa rocket that was tested out at Woomera in the 60s, and also on the British Black Arrow rocket launched out at Woomera as well. And what these were doing was enabling the tracking cameras to determine how far the rocket had actually rolled after it was launched. So they could, by measuring the angles between the diagonal and the upper and lower bands, they could actually determine how far the rocket was rolling in flight as it moved along its trajectory. And of course, beyond calculating, beyond that computing work, there were also women who were starting to come into the behind the scenes technical side, the scientific side, from the late 1950s through the 60s, and of course, much more widely involved in all aspects of space technology and space exploration these days. This lady here, I love to point out, this is Nancy Grace Roman. Some of you will have heard, of course, about the Roman Space Telescope. This is the lady it's named after. She was the very first head of NASA's astronomy division from 1959. So she was the first female executive at NASA, the first head of a section, first female head of a section. She was responsible for a number of the early space observatories. So this is the Orbiting Solar Observatory she's with here, but also the orbiting astronomical observatories. And she was involved in the development of the Hubble Space Telescope as well. So very influential in space astronomy. This lady here is Doris Jelly, sadly almost forgotten, but she was one of the first female engineers in the Canadian space program, and she was responsible for the development of the, excuse me, I'm sorry, the so-called, what did they call it? It had a special name, and I'm just trying to remember it now. It was a kind of extrudable antenna. So it was literally one that you could fold up. It was rolled up inside the satellite. And then once it was in orbit, it came out. It was on a, like a very flexible type of aluminized mylar, I think it was, that would become rigid once it was in the vacuum of space. And so Doris developed that. I actually had the pleasure of meeting her many years ago before she passed away. Really nice lady and very much undervalued in her role in early satellite development. A lot of people will have heard of Margaret Hamilton, of course, who did a lot of the computing work on Apollo. And another lady you may not be so familiar with here, Joanne Morgan, who was the first, she was an engineer during the Apollo program. She was actually the only female engineer in the room during the Apollo 11 launch. Can you see my cursor? Somebody quickly tell me if you can see my cursor there.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. So another one of the very early pioneers in the space engineering area. More recently, some of you will be familiar perhaps with Abby Alwood, the Australian planetary scientist who's been working in with JPL for a long time. She's currently got an instrument, the Pixel instrument, on the Perseverance rover on Mars. Carolyn Porco is another planetary scientist, and particularly she's an imaging specialist. So she, for example, led the Cassini imaging team. Shana Dale, you may not be familiar with, but she was the first female deputy director of NASA. It was back in 1995. And then some of you may also be familiar with Charlie Blackwell Thompson, who of course is the first female flight director for NASA. So you see, we have, women are moving into a wide variety, and have been now for 40 odd years, moving into a wide variety of positions within the within all the behind the scenes aspects that are absolutely necessary to enable space exploration and research to go forward. Now, when we first start thinking about thought about putting people into space, we had to be sure that the space environment was actually safe for them. And so animals preceded humans into space. And as it happened, many of those first animals were in fact female. So Laika, of course, the very first living creature in space. She was launched in 1957, as we know. Sadly, did not survive to return to Earth, but she was a lady, as was Miss Baker and her companion Abel. Despite the rather male name, Abel and Miss Baker were both female monkeys, and they were the first American test animal subjects to be successfully sent into space and return. They had a few predecessors who unfortunately didn't make it back to Earth, but they were the first ones to be successfully retrieved. I'm not sure if I've talked to you guys before about Félicette, the French space cat, but she has a great little story. And to say, the very first space traveler from France, and had a suborbital flight in 1963. So, women find themselves in a lot of interesting, different pioneering roles in space. Now, of course, I'm sure most of you will have heard about the Mercury 13. The story is often portrayed in a way that suggests that NASA was going to establish a female space cadre of astronauts, and then for sexist reasons decided not to. Story's not quite as straightforward as that. The actual program that they were involved in was a privately funded program that began as an initiative of Dr. Randolph Lovelace here, who ran the Lovelace Clinic, where the Mercury astronauts themselves were put through their initial medical assessments and some of the tests that helped to determine who would ultimately be selected. And Randolph and Jerry Cobb, who was a very well-known, very famous female aviator at the time in the US, and also another quite well-known female aviator, Jackie Cochran, were interested in the idea of seeing how women would compare to the experimental results of the different men who'd been tested out for the astronaut program. Now, Jackie Cochrane's husband was particularly wealthy, and so he agreed to fund a series of experiments for Lovelace to put a number of accomplished female pilots through the same set of tests as the Mercury astronauts, just to see how the women compared across that all those different medical tests. So Jerry Cobb, Jackie Cochrane, and Lovelace selected a group of about 19 women initially, pilots with over 1,000 flying hours, women with quite a range of piloting experience, and to put them through what they called the phase 1 series of experiments. Now, although it's often they're called the Mercury 13, ultimately they were not a team in the sense that the Mercury 7 were, the original Mercury astronauts, in that they tended to be tested at different times, sometimes a few of them together, sometimes just one or two individually, coming to the Lovelace Clinic to do these tests. But they were never a coherent team, and this was never a NASA-funded program. What actually sort of happened was that because the women were showing up, obviously they were getting results that were equal to the men's results in all the medical tests, and in some cases actually showing that they were better adapted to some of the potential rigors of spaceflight. Firstly, it was decided to put them to sort of go through a second series of more advanced tests that equated to some of the more intense military medical tests that the Mercury 7 would have experienced as test pilots. And Jerry Cobb at this point and Jackie Cochrane started to campaign for the idea that, if the women were doing as well as the men, why could they not actually become Mercury astronauts? And so there was a bit of a campaign developed to get them into the formal astronaut program, but in fact, they were not part of the program at that point. So there's quite a bit of agitation, political influence brought to bear to ultimately get a congressional hearing in Washington to determine whether or not women should become part of the Mercury program. And unfortunately, at this point, Jackie Cochrane actually changed her opinions about women flying in space and spoke against the idea of forming a women's astronaut corps during these congressional hearings. Of course, generally speaking, the male astronauts didn't support the women becoming involved, and technically they didn't have one of the qualifications that NASA had insisted on, which was that they have jet piloting and particularly military test, I'll get my tongue around this, military test piloting experience. And this, in fact, was used as the sort of stumbling block to ultimately deny them the opportunity to be formally enrolled into any kind of astronaut program. And so at that point, essentially, the whole thing sort of died. But these are the women who were involved. Jan and Marion Dietrich there, they were twin sisters. Several of these other ladies were very, very experienced pilots. Some of them did have jet piloting experience, as did Jackie Cochrane. Jerry Cobb. And in fact, Jerry Cobb, funded by Jackie Cochrane, was the only one that Lovelace put through all 3 phases of the original astronaut training. And in fact, she came out with equal to, and in some cases, better results than some of the Mercury astronauts. Some of the other ladies here, Wally Funk, of course, she was actually just about the youngest of the women who took part in the original Lovelace Clinic tests. And she became the only one of the Mercury 13 to actually make it into space. And that was when she was invited to be part of the crew of the very first Blue Origin flight in July 2020. At that time, she was 82, which made her, for a short period, the oldest person to travel in space. William Shatner pipped her a few months later when he flew, but she still remains the oldest woman to have flown in space. Of course, the suborbital flight had just tipped over the Kármán line, but that meant that she was the only one of the Mercury 13 to make that space flight. Interestingly, after the Soviets flew Valentina Tereshkova, toward the end of the 60s, there was a bit of an agitation, again, a suggestion of America possibly forming at least a small group of female astronauts to try and counter the propaganda advantage that the Russians had with Tereshkova. And they did consider inviting Jerry Cobb and Jackie Cochran to become their female astronauts, but ultimately that program didn't go forward, and so neither of them ever had that opportunity to fly in space. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Russians, of course, put the first woman into space. That was Valentina Tereshkova, and that was in the June 13 of 1963. Now, interestingly, the around about the time that the Mercury 13 were undergoing their tests in the US, Nikolai Kamanin, who was the head of the astronaut, the Soviet astronaut corps or cosmonaut corps, he was convinced that it would be a good idea for the Soviet Union to actually fly some women in space, partly for the, the propaganda value to illustrate that, women and men were equal in the Soviet Union. And so he persuaded Sergei Korolev, who, of course, the chief designer of the program, but I've already mentioned that this would be a good idea. Together, they persuaded Mstislav Keldysh, who was one of the leading members of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and ultimately the idea of a small female cosmonaut team was approved by the Premier Khrushchev. And so a campaign was put in place to recruit some female cosmonauts. Initially, they weren't sure exactly how many they were going to require or wanted to recruit, but about 800 women actually applied when the word first began to get out that there was an interest in having a female cosmonaut corps. And in fact, there was some active recruiting done, particularly in aviation schools and parachuting schools. And the interesting difference between the Mercury women and the Soviet ladies was that being a pilot wasn't a criterion for the selection of the women in the Soviet Union. The main criterion there, or certainly one of them, was parachuting skills. And the reason for that, of course, was that the Vostok spacecraft, because the engineers were not completely confident in the retro landing system, the landing on the ground, as the cosmonauts actually bailed out before landing, so that they parachuted down separately from their spacecraft, although that was kept secret for over 20 years before that was widely known. So what they needed, and of course the Vostok also, I should say, was very, very heavily automated. And so it was normally, excuse me, the Vostok flights were normally largely controlled from the ground. So the recruiters were much more interested in parachuting skills. And there was, so there's about 800 women applied. There was an initial selection of, I think it was about 56. Then that was whittled down to about 18 or 19. And further tests, again, whittled that down ultimately to 5. It was quite interesting in the end. Tereshkova herself was selected partly because she was a champion parachutist, but also politically she was a good fit. She came from a peasant family. Her father had died during the Second World War, so as in the Soviet military, and she was also active in the youth wing of the Communist Party. Similarly, actually, Tatiana Kuznetsova, this young lady here, who was the youngest, she was actually a lab assistant, but she was also the party secretary of the communist group within the Moscow Institute of Radiotechnics, and it was a partly political reason that she was selected. Zhana Yurkina, this lady, she was actually a school teacher, but she also spoke French and German. And in addition, she was, a major parachuting champion in the Soviet Union. Irina Solovyeva, she was actually an engineer and a scientist, as well as, again, being a champion parachutist. And in many ways, Valentina Ponomareva was the most interesting one, in that she was a professional mathematician. She was also an experienced pilot. And she was a mother, but she had very little parachuting experience compared to the other women, but her general professional qualifications led to her ultimately being accepted, even though there was a lot of concern about actually accepting a mother into a dangerous position like cosmonaut. And in fact, I was very fortunate to have dinner with Ponomareva one time. We had a really interesting talk about her time in the cosmonaut corps, and she was very likely to have actually been the first woman in space, except for the fact that she came from a bureaucratic family rather than a peasant family, and again, because she was a mother, there was a lot of hesitation to allowing her to be the first woman to undertake that dangerous first space flight. And so ultimately, for a combination of reasons of both her performance in the training and also her good communist and peasant qualifications, Tereshkova became the very first woman to travel in space. As I've mentioned, she was a champion parachutist, and one of the things that they had to do was bail out of the Vostok before landing. So they put the women through pretty much the same training routine as the men. They had to learn this, the same skills. They weren't, as I've mentioned, expected to be as proficient as pilots, but it was anticipated that their missions would largely be conducted from the ground anyway. So Tereshkova ultimately made the last flight of the Vostok program with Bykovsky in Vostok 5, so they flew it as a twin mission, even though unlike the Gemini missions, these spacecraft could not actually rendezvous. But what the Russians did was to time the launches very carefully so that their orbits very closely matched. But, Tereshkova made that first flight, which of course made her particularly important to the USSR as a propaganda tool, essentially. So you'd often see her with Gagarin and the other, particularly she and Gagarin would be trotted out on a wide range of occasions for, to score political points or to promote the Soviet lead, supposedly at least in the space race at the time. She was it about 8 months after her flight? I might be wrong on that timing. She married fellow cosmonaut Adrian Nikolaev. They had a daughter, Elena, who was the first child born with 2 space travelers who were parents. And as I've mentioned, Tereshkova made a number of trips around the world. She was involved in a lot of the Soviet programs for reaching out into the non-aligned world, or the third world, as we used to call it, the developing world, to encourage people to support the Soviet Union rather than the West. And here she is in India, actually, with Indira Gandhi. Actually, interestingly too, within about 12 months of Tereshkova's flight, all of the other women who were not married had become married. And in fact, essentially what happened after that, there was some talk during the Vostok program of possibly doing a flight with a crew of perhaps 3 women, or else 2 women, one of whom would then do a spacewalk, so paralleling Alexei Leonov's spacewalk, excuse me, on Voskhod 2. But in the end, especially after Korolev passed away in 66, the political will for that one fell away, and so that particular space spectacular, as it would have been, never occurred. So after that, there essentially were, the Soviet Union disbanded their female program, and the United States wasn't interested in having women in their space program. I shouldn't say they weren't interested, but the way that the space program was structured at that time, women weren't eligible to be part of the program. And it's not until the 1970s when there's this interest in the United States in actually, of course, with, you know, the rise of the women's liberation movement and the growth of equal rights movements and things across the 1960s and into the 70s. There were changes made to the military legislation that then allowed women to join the military services in roles that had previously been barred to them, which eventually would include pilots. And we'll talk about that again a little bit later. But NASA did have to, or made a decision then, that it would open up the astronaut corps to women, because with the space shuttle program beginning, it was possible that, you know, there would be many roles for women with relevant scientific and engineering training as mission specialists, because the shuttle, unlike the earlier Apollo programs, would have a pilot and commander who would initially at least come from military backgrounds. But there would be a lot of roles for scientists in the space lab and in the other experimental programs that could be carried out on the shuttle. So 1978, we had the first group of women. You see the 6 of them here, who were selected as the first American female astronauts. And you can see they're all very well qualified. Ray Seddon here, she's a physician and surgeon. Catherine Sullivan, the geologist. Judith Resnick, an absolutely incredible woman. She was an electrical engineer, software engineer, biomedical engineer, very, very highly qualified. Sally Ride, of course, who was a physicist, and so on. Anna Fisher, who was also a chemist, as well as being a doctor, and also a mother. And so again, that opened up that interesting question. And there was a lot of discussion about whether a mother should be accepted into the space program because of her social responsibilities, cultural responsibilities to her children. And then, of course, Shannon Lucid, the biochemist, who actually stayed in the program longer than any of the other of the original female astronauts. And in fact, the selection of the female astronauts actually led to the beginnings of a change in science fiction, where you're starting to see then more women, certainly in media science fiction, in more active roles where they're taking a lead more like we would have seen our male heroes earlier on. So, for example, in some of you might remember the old Buck Rogers serials from the 30s, and Wilma Deering, who was Buck's offsider and his sort of love interest, who was, very often clinging to Buck for support. But in the 1978, 1980 TV show Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, Colonel Wilma Deering becomes a kick-ass head of, or senior leader of the Earth Space Force. And we often see her, doing quite dashing exploits. Interestingly, Battlestar Galactica, when it was first created, although it had a female in the main group of characters, she was again a more of a mission controller rather than one of the active astronauts. But when they rebooted the series in the 2000s, they reimagined Starbuck, who was the sort of wisecracking Han Solo type character, was reimagined as a female version who was just as wisecracking, just as feisty, and literally a female version of the original Starbuck. And of course, we also see in the early 90s, we see the first Star Trek Starship Commander, Captain Janeway. So we do start to see the change in the way women are portrayed on the screen, as well as reflecting somewhat of the reality of women becoming involved in the space program. Now, what's really interesting, of course, is that the Cold War hadn't died at this point. And when America announced that Sally Ride would become the first American woman in space, going to fly on the shuttle in 1983, the Russians decided that it was time to get another woman back into space. And Svetlana Savitskaya, the lady we see here, became the first and effectively the only member of another generation of Soviet female cosmonauts. Interestingly, again, there was some discussion as to whether they might be able to reactivate Valentina Tereshkova, and I think it was Zhana Yorkina was another one of the original women cosmonauts, and whether they could actually get them trained up in time to get them into orbit before Sally Ride flew. But actually, they were both over the official age for cosmonaut selection at that time. So Tereshkova was 40, and I think Yorkina was about 35 or something. It might have, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But Savitskaya here was actually the daughter of a very highly placed Soviet general. And apparently there was political pressure brought to bear specifically for her to be selected. She was a very experienced pilot. And she was a test pilot, as a matter of fact, so that ultimately she became the next female Soviet cosmonaut and was rushed into space ahead of Sally Ride's first flight. And in fact, when the NASA decided that, excuse me, Kathy Sullivan would make the first spacewalk, or first American female spacewalk in 1984, Savitskaya was rushed up to the Salyut 7 space station and made the first female spacewalk to do some work on the space station itself. So, they weren't forgetting this idea of trying to pip the Americans in good old Cold War propaganda style. And in fact, when Shannon Lucid was slated to become the first woman on the Mir space station as part of the Shuttle Mir program, this was in whatever it was, 1996. Before that, they rushed up Yelena Kondakova as the next Soviet cosmonaut to the Mir space station, and she was up there for 169 days. So she set what, of course, was a long duration record for women, although Shannon Lucid actually broke that during her stay on Mir, and that record then lasted until 2007. Now, over the shuttle program, as I've already mentioned, there became more opportunities for women to fly. Kathy Thornton, we see her here, was the first woman to fly on a military shuttle mission. That was in '89. Of course, you had Eileen Collins. By this time, women were able to become military test pilots and even combat pilots. And Eileen Collins ultimately became from her military experience, the first space shuttle pilot in 1995. And she went on to become, female space shuttle pilot. And then she went on to become the first female commander in 1999. Mae Jemison, the first black female astronaut. Again, she became a wonderful role model for women and girls, particularly in the Black community. Eleanor Coa, the first Hispanic American, that was 93. And ultimately also Barbara Morgan became the first educator astronaut in 2007. And Barbara, of course, had been the original backup to Krista McAuliffe, who was intended to be the first teacher in space, but who died along with Judy Resnick and, of course, the other members of the Challenger crew in the loss of Challenger in 1986. And interestingly, or I shouldn't say interestingly, that's not quite the word to use, but, you know, by this stage, women are sharing all the experiences of the space shuttle program, which includes being lost in the tragedies of both Challenger and Columbia in 2003. Of course, we've just a couple of months ago marked the 20th anniversary of that as well. And in that mission, Kalpana Chawla, the first Indian American, and Laurel Clark were both lost, along with the other members of the crew and the very first Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. So, as I say, you know, women have more and more assumed the roles and the dangers of being involved in space exploration. Women have also been either the first or at least astronauts for various other countries as well. So Roberta Bondar was the first Canadian astronaut, female astronaut. Jackie Mukai, the first Japanese astronaut. Interestingly, the Russia flew a Yelena Kondakova again as a female member of the, excuse me, I'm sorry, of the shuttle program. And then Serova, whose first name is just escaping me for the moment, she was actually the first Russian cosmonaut to fly to the International Space Station. Helen Sharman, some of you will be familiar with, the very first British female cosmonaut. In fact, she was technically speaking, she was the very first European female, although she was not flying for ESA. In fact, hers was an interesting program because it was largely funded by a lot of private funding rather than government funding. And she flew as with the end of the USSR. So she flew in, what was that, 1991, on a program called the Juno mission. Claudie André Deshaies, later Claudie Agnières, was the first French female astronaut. I'm sure many of you will know Soyeon Yi, who of course has come out to Australia several times. We had her speak at the Powerhouse. She was the very first, pardon me, South Korean astronaut. Samantha Cristoforetti, ESA astronaut, and also the first female space traveler from Italy. So, you know, we've had women from a growing number of nations around the world. There have actually been female candidates. One of the first candidates to be an Iranian astronaut was actually a woman. One of the first candidates for the Malaysian astronaut, I think it was also a woman as well, although in the end it was one of the male candidates that was ultimately selected. China has also incorporated women into their space program. This is Colonel Liu Yang, who first flew on the Shenzhou 9 in 2012, and that actually went to the Tiangong space station, the original prototype Tiangong space station. And more recently, of course, she has flown again for the longest stay so far by a female Chinese taikonaut for what is it now? She's got a cumulative total of 197 days in space. This is Wang Yaoping, who flew on the Shenzhou 10 mission. She also flew to Tiangong 1 and actually acted in the role of a teacher from space as well, giving lessons back to school children in China. And she, in fact, this is an interesting thing, on the 50th anniversary of Tereshkova's flight, so in 2013, there were two women in space. There was Wang Yaoping and the American astronaut, the NASA astronaut, Karen Nyberg, who was on the International Space Station. So we had a Chinese woman working on one of the space stations, an American woman working on the International Space Station. As it's a nice way that, not deliberate, it was a good way to mark the 50th anniversary of the first woman in space. And more recently, Wang Yaoping became the made the first Chinese female spacewalk as well. And that was in 2021. And here she is waving back at the camera from outside the Tiangong space station. Now, you can call them space tourists or you can call them space flight participants, but we've also had women assuming these roles as well. Anusha Ansari was the first non-professional astronaut to travel in space. And this was, of course, as part of the, what's the name of this, 2006. So she was part of a space tourism program that was organized by Space Adventures that would take people in the Soyuz vehicle to the Russian segment of the International Space Station. Initially, NASA did not allow the space tourists to enter into the US segment of the station. So they would only be resident in the Russian section. But Anusha Ansari came from a quite well-off family that was involved in a lot of space-related projects, including funding the X Prize, which of course led to the development of Spaceship One, that then led on to Virgin Galactic. And she was actually very interested in space education. So while she was on the space station, she actually did various experiments in growing plants, for example, and conducted some lessons back to the Earth for school kids. Some of you might know that it was just last year that they had the filming that was done on the International Space Station for a Russian movie, so that we actually had the film director and this lady whose name, of course, has just gone straight out of my head. Let me just check my notes here. Very, very annoying, and I'm sorry about that. I just cannot remember this woman's name. Actually, quite well-known Russian actress, and they've been involved in making a film. They recorded about 20 minutes worth of actual footage on the ISS, and that's being incorporated into a movie which is being released in Russia this year, I think, either this year or early the following year. A couple of other people I'd like to mention. Peggy Whitson. I hope you have actually heard about Peggy. She actually started initially working at Johnson in the biosciences area, and she's now got the most cumulative time in space for a US astronaut. So she already has 665 days in space. She has made the most EVAs. She's had 10 spacewalks over the length of her career, and also had the most time on EVA, over 60 hours of all the female space travelers. She's been the commander of the ISS in 2007, and again, I think it was 2016, I think she was commander again. She was the first female chief of the astronaut office. And interestingly, she was also the commander of the 2003 Nemo 5 expedition. These are undersea habitat expeditions that NASA uses to investigate a range of psychological health and medical health issues around long duration space flight and, crews working together, perhaps in a future space habitat on Mars or on the moon. And here she is as the mission commander there. So very, very, very talented, very experienced lady. And when Pam Melroy, who I'm sure many of you know, she's come out to Australia many times, Pam was the third female space shuttle pilot. She was the second space shuttle female space shuttle commander. And on her flight to the ISS as commander, Peggy Whitson was the also the commander of the ISS. So it was the very first time we had a female shuttle commander and a female commander of the ISS together in space at the same time. More recently, of course, with the Artemis team, NASA had made a selection of an equal number of men and women. This is actually the first time that they had an absolutely equal selection of men and women. So the overall Artemis team you can see here, and the grouping that has been selected. Excuse me, pardon me, I'll get my throat around this. Excuse me for just a minute. Sorry. Yeah, so that was the this was the actual, I'm sorry, let me get this right. Excuse me, I've had a bit of a headache tonight and I'm just having a little trouble concentrating. This was the 21st astronaut group of selected in 2013, and this was the group that had the very first equal representation of the number of men and women in the selection. And then many of these astronauts were part of NASA's Artemis team, which was also equally selected, equal numbers of men and women. The first female spacewalk, actually all female spacewalk, took place in 2019 with Christina Koch and Jessica Meyer. And Christina Koch, who actually holds the record for the longest single space flight by a woman, was announced as the one of the members of the, I'm sorry, did I get that right? Yeah. One of the people being selected for the Artemis 2 mission around the moon. And of course, more recently, we're seeing women involved in the programs like Crew Dragon with SpaceX. So Shannon Walker, who is Andy Thomas's wife, was actually part of the first Crew Dragon mission. We've seen other women on some of the other Crew Dragon missions. Sunita Williams was selected for the original Boeing Starliner mission, although that's since, of course, been indefinitely delayed. We've seen women flying on the very first Virgin Galactic flight back in 2020 with Richard Branson. Wally Funk, I've already mentioned, of course, with Blue Origin. Other people flying Blue Origin. This was, what was this lady's? Audrey Powers. She was actually a senior vice president of operations with Blue Origin. She flew on that same flight with William Shatner and, of course, Chris Boschwiesen from Australia. Some of you might remember the Inspiration 4 mission, which was a privately funded SpaceX flight. And again, we had the two women flying there, including Haley Arsenyau, I think that's how she pronounces her name. And she's the youngest person to fly in space so far. So you can see we've got women in virtually all the roles that you can have in space these days. And I'd just like to finish, of course, by pointing out some of the Australian women who are involved in participating in space, not only here in Australia, but overseas as well. I'm sure you'll know some of these people. I'm sure many of them have actually spoken to the NSSA at different times. Megan Clark, of course, the first head of the Australian Space Agency. Graziella Caparelli, I know she's spoken to us before. Carly Scott was the original CEO of Equatorial Launch Australia, which of course successfully launched their first commercial sounding rocket launches last year from the Arnhem Space Centre. Flavia Tata Nardini, who is the head of the Fleet Space Company. Alice Gorman, many of you know, the space archaeologist. Andrea Boyd, who's actually an ISS flight controller, but working with the European Space Agency. Cassandra Steer at ANU, very respected space law academic. Kimberly Clayfield, again with CSIRO. She's been involved in their space area for a long time. Bex Dunn at Geoscience Australia. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list by any means. And this year we've had, firstly, Megan Christian, who has been selected as an ESA astronaut, but has a very close connection to Australia, having spent pretty much her entire education here. And just a couple of weeks ago, I hope you've all heard about Catherine Bennell Pegg being going over to ESA now to train as an astronaut, but as an Australian national astronaut, so that when she flies, as we hope she will at some point in the future, she'll be wearing an Australian flag on her shoulder. She's training with ESA, but she is not training as an ESA astronaut. She is in training as an Australian astronaut. And so we look forward to a very exciting future with actually having the first Australian woman flying in space at some point in the future. And thank you very much. Sorry, I was just losing things a little bit there towards the end.
That's great, Kerrie. Actually, you're talking about Peggy Wetson. Peggy Wetson is actually doing another flight for Axiom Space in a couple of months.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Going up again. So that record is going to be extended.
Yes, that's right. She's an absolutely amazing woman. Absolutely amazing woman.
Going to be the mission commander of the second Axiom Space flight that's going up on the Dragon.
Yes, that's right. And of course, Pam Melroy now is the deputy director of NASA. I think she's the 5th female deputy director, 4th or 5th female deputy director. So, you know, that's a great achievement in itself. I'm kind of hoping that one of these days she might actually become director of NASA. You know, the actual administrator, which would be really.
I think it all really
exciting.
depends on timing. I mean, it was interesting. I saw the for those people who wanted to look at the introduction of the Artemis 2 crew, there's actually a very good YouTube video on it that's available now if you want to look at the NASA announcements, and it's got some of the people there, and it's very good coverage of talking about all of those, including former Senator Nelson. He actually did a space flight as well.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, well, that was pretty much the ultimate boondoggle.
Yes, that was. That's correct.
Well, there were the two politicians. There was him and Jake Garn, who Jake Garn was the senator, and Bill Nelson was his equivalent in the House of Reps.
That's right.
And I think Garn flew first, and then I can see you there, Anne, just a second. Okay. Garn flew first, and then Bill Nelson, of course, had to have his day in the sun if the other guy got a space flight.
One thing about Bill Nelson, though, he's a stayer. He's been very supportive of space for about 30 years.
He has, yeah.
Well,
oddly enough, he and I were actually guests at the same function in Florida back in 1986. It was my first trip to the US, and it's a long story, but I wound up being asked to be a speaker at an event in Florida. And he was also on the bill, having, of course, come back at the beginning of '86 from his space flight. So he was a much bigger draw card than me. I was just the interesting foreigner.
Interesting character. Questions from
So sorry, Anne. Yes, you had a question.
I just when have the Russians pipped the U.S. at the post a few times with getting women over the line in a number of ways, but it looks like now ESA and the U.S. and most of the programs are pretty equal. But how are the Russians doing in that respect nowadays? How do they have very many female astronauts? Because I must admit
I'm
that
not
when
aware
I see
not
ISS
aware of
crews,
any. I mean, apart
yeah,
from
I don't see any women.
yeah, no. Well, apart from, and I should have checked this up actually before I came on this afternoon. But apart from the one who went to the ISS, whose name is now escaping me, Sarava. She was the last one I'm aware of.
Mm.
And we certainly haven't seen any fly to the ISS since then.
Just the actress.
Yes. Well, I mean, she's not an astronaut in the same sense. She's a space flight participant or space tourist or paying passenger or whatever you'd like to call her. But no, at the moment, I'm not aware of there being any other.
Sorry, just for a second. I actually think there was one that went up on the Dragon representing the Russians. She was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I think you're right. There was one on. She was on
up on a Soyuz.
4, I think it might have been
very recently.
Yeah, I think it might have been Crew Dragon 4 actually.
She basically, I don't think she's still up there now. I think she's come back, but she was there for a while, and probably going up on Suez could be a bit of a problem at the moment, given the fact that it's had a few leaks. But
yes,
quality control issues at the moment. They've got some serious things they have to look at.
But again, if she may be the only one though.
That's right, and she didn't fly up on the Soyuz. She actually went up on the Crew Dragon.
Yeah, she went up on the Crew Dragon. Yes, you're right. That had slipped my mind, that one.
Swap. But I only just thought of that too. But she's not that well known. I'll have to go and look her name up. She's actually fairly young though, by comparison, I think.
I'm sorry, what was that?
She's relatively young, I think.
Yes, she looked it from the pictures.
So I'll have to look the name up. I haven't had a chance to do that, but I wasn't thinking about having to do that.
I think her name was Yulia, I think.
The actress's name was Julia.
Yeah, I have a feeling this Russian.
The other one was too?
I think she was. I might be wrong about that. But I think her name might have been Yulia as well. So, anybody got any questions?
Actually,
otherwise, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to call it a day if you don't.
One more question about the ESA astronaut that had spent a lot of time in Australia. Did she have dual nationality, I think, didn't she? That was where the complication comes from.
Well, she actually has New Zealand citizenship, British citizenship, Australian citizenship, and Italian citizenship.
Everybody wants her.
Everybody wants her. But she, and my understanding is that she got, Catherine Bennell-Pegg applied because she also has dual British Australian citizenship. Catherine applied last year as part of that last round of ESA selection, as did Megan.
Right.
And I believe it came down to a bit of a runoff between Megan and Catherine over which one would be selected. And Megan had more connection to Europe. She's been working in Europe for a long time. She actually has lived in Europe for some time, even though she did her education here in Australia. So, and her parents are British. Right. So she was considered to have a closer connection to Europe, I think that was the sort of thing. But, we're very pleased to see that now Catherine is representing Australia as she's not just being an ESA astronaut, she's actually being an Australian astronaut.
Yeah, it's very good. The
Yeah,
agency.
that's a huge change.
That's the wonderful thing about this.
That's definitely true. And I can imagine people like Andy Thomas would have wished that they'd been able to do so, but he
Yes. Yeah. Well, Andy, of course, was eventually able to reactivate his Australian citizenship.
and that
So
was
in his later missions, he was actually from the Mir mission. He was actually flying as a dual citizen, or he had dual citizenship while he was flying, but he was still flying as an American astronaut.
yeah, you did finally get it activated, which was great.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Jeanette Rothapfel and I went to see him off
That's interesting.
out in Australia to see his
They must have
parents,
changed the law because of him.
just because they live out here, and before he was going to depart from here, he came out to see them. It was just before the Christmas of what would that have been? Well, it would have been the Christmas of '97, because he was launched in early '98.
Yep.
And Jeanette and I went out to see him at Sydney Airport just to catch up with him before he went back to the US to prepare for that flight. And he was very proudly showing us his Australian citizenship certificate that he'd sort of got back like only the day beforehand. So that, that was really nice. He was very, very proud of that.
I'm sure he still is.
I'm
Okay.
sure he still is, yes.
Yep.
But, he was so pleased that he was, because they'd changed the citizenship laws in the US, he was able to become an Australian citizen again, which he'd had to give up previously. And of course, so did, Scully Powell wanted to work with the US Navy. And
Yeah.
so even though as a civilian, but he had to be an American citizen to do that. So again, he gave up his citizenship. And in fact, so did Phil Chapman, because when Phil decided that he wanted to apply to be an astronaut, again, he had to be an American. So he gave up his citizenship and became an American citizen.
Yeah, and Phil was actually very early days too, wasn't he? One of the scientists.
No, that was 67, yeah.
So early that most people, he's in the same group that Harrison Smith was in. So
Yeah, that's right.
that's right. And look at it now, he did pass on a couple of years ago, but he actually spent most of his life in the US early on, at least. I mean, he may have come back to Australia.
Oh yeah, he came back to Australia fairly late in the piece for a little while, but spent most of his life in the US. When he passed away, he was in the US.
Yep, that's right.
Somebody's got a dog.
Any more questions?
Sorry?
No?
Oh, by the way, Brennan, my colleague Brennan Dew, has put a
Yes,
little
he's put
note
the
in
link
the chat with
Yes, you're right. So the thing to note is Brennan's actually got a very good link in there about the times where we actually asked what was going to happen at different times for different places, and that sounds like that will solve the problem. And the other piece of news is about the Starship launch. Yes, you're correct. It is 10 o'clock tonight. Looking at the US times, I've just done a conversion on it, and they said that it's very close, but we don't know whether it's going to launch. But it looks like they want to launch it.
Oh, I think that's what they're going to do. Yeah, well, they're certainly going to make the attempt. So we'll see what
Those people
happens.
Yep. For those people who would like to stay on, or at least look at it later on in the, it should be available, I think, on the feed. So
yeah. I should point out too, you can't see the T-shirt I'm wearing. You might be able to see the top of it. It says "Space has no," and the bottom part says "glass ceiling." So space has no glass ceiling. So in other words, women can do whatever the men can do.
Very good.
Just had one final comment, if I can, which is another important woman in the space sector, author of this book, Kerrie Dougherty, who wrote Australia in Space. As many people would know, curated the Powerhouse exhibition. So thanks for the great talk, Kerrie.
Yes, I think I'd like to echo that too. Thank you very much, Kerrie. It was very, very interesting as always.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Very good talk.
We learned a lot about a lot of different people there and how many different activities they're involved with. So many.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of women there, even the ones who aren't traveling in space. There's a lot of women behind the scenes that have been supporting space activities for a very long time. And think we should actually give credit to a lot of those long-suffering wives and girlfriends who have
Yes.
supported their men along the way.
Mhm. Or the First Wives Clubbers, I think is what the
Yes, yes.